Thank you all for being with us here today. My name is Elliot Comite. I was the Excel class of 2013, and currently I work in technology investing at a venture capital firm here in New York called Stripes Group. Dan, would you mind introducing yourself?
I'm Dan Doctoroff. I'm, as you heard, the CEO of Sidewalk Labs, which is a alphabet company focused on improving sort of urban life by building a city. Literally, we can talk more about that. But before that, I've had a bunch of different careers. I started in investment banking, went to private equity, became deputy mayor of New York for the 6 years right after 9/11, then ran Bloomberg LP before doing that, and along the way have done a bunch of not-for-profit stuff, including leading the effort to bring the Olympics to New York, and then more recently building what really is going to be New York's coolest cultural institution, the Shed. So hopefully we can talk about a bunch of those different things. It's what happens when you live to be 60 years old. You can do a lot of different things.
Like many in the audience, and as we heard in the panel before, there's a lot of people here that have started and are building their careers in the for-profit world. And are also thinking about how to impact maybe outside of their work, maybe as part of their core work, as part of the nonprofit world. As someone who straddled that line for many years in your career, what compelled you to spend time when you're beginning public service to make the original flip from for-profit to public service? And is there any advice you'd give to young people in the audience as they're thinking about navigating those different paths?
Sure. There's a lot to unpack there. So the bridge for me between private equity and government was sort of the crazy idea I came up with, which was to bring the Olympics to New York. Ellie and I were just talking about how much we hate going to the Meadowlands in New Jersey. But back in 1994, the World Cup was held in the United States. And a friend dragged me out to the Meadowlands on a hot July day to watch a match that I actually could not have cared less about. It was a semifinal game of the World Cup. It was against Italy, Bulgaria versus Bulgaria, two countries I didn't care about in a sport I hated. But in any event, we went because I thought, a World Cup will probably never be back in the United States in my lifetime. And so I walked into the stadium, and it was the most amazing thing that I'd ever seen. You couldn't sit down the entire match. Flags were waving, faces were painted, fans were chanting. And I thought to myself while I was standing there, the thing that's so amazing about New York is you could play that game with any two countries in the world, and it'd feel almost exactly the same. Stands were filled with Italian Americans, presumably Bulgarian Americans, Italians, Bulgarians, whatever. And I thought to myself, well, why has New York, what I thought was the most international city in the world, never hosted the world's most international event, the Olympics? So I left the stadium that day with this crazy idea that New York ought to host the Olympics. Lo and behold, after studying the idea for a year and a half, I start shopping it around to people sort of in the city. And what I was really shopping was the idea that an event like the Olympics could act as a catalyst to getting things done that were otherwise politically or financially really difficult. And so the idea of the Olympics morphed into a physical plan for the physical future of New York. One of the people who I took it to get some money out of him was Mike Bloomberg, who, when he ran for mayor, stole a bunch of the ideas, and then when he, shockingly after 9/11, was elected as mayor, asked me to come and be his deputy mayor. And I said no, and he persisted, and I said no again. Finally, I relented, and so my transition was sort of a funny one. You talked about lessons. The most important lesson I can impart to all of you is what I call the rule of 2.5. Okay, so think of there being 4 quadrants to your life, potentially. There is your work, your family, your friends, and the other stuff you want to do, your outside interest. My hypothesis is that no one can actually do more than 2.5 of them well at any one time. And so what you have to think about is your life over a long period of time and recognize that you can't do everything at once, But instead what you want to do is think about your life and career sort of dynamically and recognize that it's going to evolve over time. And I think if you kind of think about that, it's generally a pretty good guide. Other thing is, the decision, for example, to go into government. I found I could never recruit anybody into government for whom coming into government would actually necessitate a change in their lifestyle. There was like a 0% chance that somebody who had obligations, a mortgage, kids in school, whatever, was ever going to give anything up in order to come into government. We could get people laterally from not-for-profits. We could get people who hadn't yet established a lifestyle, and so all they cared about was having a decent apartment and going on vacation a couple times a year. They take the salary cut to do it. So the point is that you also have to think of your career not just sort of according to the law of 2.5, but you have to think of it in terms of like real world stuff, like money and time. And so it's something I really enjoy giving people advice because, I've had to learn these lessons the hard way.
So it seems like there's a mix of both idealism and pragmatism in terms of thinking about how to affect change from the private sector and then for-profit as you're thinking about attracting and then retaining top talent. You wrote a great book called Greater Than Ever, which I got a chance to read and really enjoyed it. And one of the insights or a key thing that you kind of discuss is in many ways how your own background, starting in private equity and in finance, helped you in many of the ways and when you were a deputy mayor for Mayor Bloomberg in thinking about new ways to look at the budget, look at zoning, look at other things that could be impactful. When you think about a broad group as here, young professionals, how can, in your expertise, thinking about interdisciplinary work, taking one thing and moving it to another, help young people succeed in general?
Well, look, there's some basic skills that if you have can be extremely valuable no matter what you do. Maybe the single most valuable from my perspective is financial skills and more specifically having a rigorous approach to thinking about sort of the relationship between risk and or investment and return. Now, in the business world, we tend to think of that almost exclusively in financial or monetary terms. In other contexts, we don't. In government, we have to think about lots of other factors that generally wouldn't come into play. But what I have found in every single thing that I have done, so whether it is business, and that's big companies, little companies, whether it's not-for-profits, whether it is government, that having that disciplined approach is really important. In fact, I created at the University of Chicago Law School, where I went to law school, a program so that every graduate of the law school could actually have like up to 6 or 7 classes that they would ordinarily have to go to business school for, because I believe so strongly in those skills. So, having a set of skills that really create that discipline, which was one of the things that we really did bring into government in the Bloomberg administration, is really important.
Makes sense. As the time when you were deputy mayor, you were a part of many controversial decisions that affected the lives of 10 plus million New York City residents. Some of those better known decisions were the choice to ban smoking in restaurants, fighting for New York to be the 2012 International Olympic Committee bid, and also the attempt to build a stadium that we just talked about on the west side here in Manhattan. How did you think about public opinion when making decisions that you thought might have been best for individuals, but that communities and thinking about what's coming up next Tuesday, that polls might have suggested weren't such a great idea?
Really interesting, and the Bloomberg administration was quite different from that perspective. We did not give a shit. Now, look, you obviously want to be sensitive to the needs of a community, and we did do a very good job of listening up to a point, but I will tell you that in my 6 years in the Bloomberg administration, and these were incredibly complicated times because you got to remember, we came into City Hall literally 3.5 months after 9/11. I mean, the fires had just gone out at Ground Zero, and so there was a lot of emotion and a lot of complicated issues to work through. But I will tell you, in 6 years, I can never remember one time actually making a decision, or Mike Bloomberg making a decision, where we asked ourselves, well, what would the impact be, for example, on his reelection prospects? Never, at least till he started actually running for reelection, did we ever do polling on any issue at all. We listened, we developed our point of view and instincts, we developed our plans, we then put them out there, we listened some more. Over time, we got better at listening and reflecting, and we generally won. I think in my domain, which was everything physical and financial in the city, in my 6 years, we initiated 289 separate initiatives. We ended up winning, about 286 of them, and you happen to mention 2 of the 3 that still are painful. But the third one, by the way, is congestion pricing, which we lost. It's coming back, by the way, next year, and we will be redeemed. But you basically learn that at the end of the day, you lead from the front. You don't lead from the back. Mm-hmm. Okay, you got to be sensitive to what people are thinking and feeling, but at the end of the day, somebody has to stand up and say yes. And that, at least as we were thinking about it, was really from the government.
Your book is also sprinkled with different mentions about Jewish identity. And a couple examples that stick out in my mind relate to the Olympic bid, where some of the people associated with Paris were calling the group that you were leading from New York the Jewish bid. This anecdote made me think of a couple questions. First, did you personally ever feel that anti-Semitism has held you back from achieving anything that you wanted to? And second, and a little more positively, how has your Jewish identity guided aspects of your decision-making throughout your career?
So with that one exception, when we were bidding for the Olympics, there clearly was, a degree of anti-Semitism that sort of was generally subterranean. You couldn't, other than that one incident, you couldn't really pinpoint it, but it was clearly there. Other than that, I have certainly never, ever, in my professional career, experienced it in any way. In New York, Semitism is a positive. So just, I'm joking. It doesn't matter here at all. But it has not played a role in any way. I will say, I grew up in a suburb of Detroit. When we moved into that suburb, I was about 11, and it's a very non-Jewish suburb. In fact, in my high school class, I think there ended up being about 20 Jewish kids out of 700. And the first summer we moved in, we went away on vacation, and somebody painted a swastika on the lawn. So I was always very conscious of it and assumed that it would be a problem. Even in that town, it never turned out to be. As to your question of kind of Jewish kind of identity or values, for me, Jewish identity is just a part of who I am, even though I grew up in a completely irreligious household. I wasn't even bar mitzvahed. I'll tell you a funny story about this. I was not bar mitzvahed when I was of normal age, and I met my wife freshman year of college. I asked her on a date, and she said, "Well, sure, I'd love to go out with you for Friday night, but I don't ride on Friday." I had no idea what she was talking about. So in any event, needless to say, as these things go, she's very observant. I was not. I adjusted over time and decided that before we got married, which we did when we were only 23, that I would have my bar mitzvah before getting married. And so it was scheduled for the morning before the wedding, morning being on a Shabbat morning. Unbeknownst to me, my brothers and friends had arranged for my bachelor party the night before. And so we were out quite late, and I was still drunk when I woke up. And I get up to the bima. I was actually going to do like a long Haftorah portion, and I thought I really knew this, but I get up to the bima. I had forgotten my glasses, and so as I get up there to start chanting the prayers before the Haftorah, the bima started sinking into the ground. I couldn't see it. The first 5 words were in a language not known to man. I panicked, particularly given like half of my wife's family are rabbis. And fortunately, adrenaline kicked in. I had the whole thing memorized and I was fine. But so you ask how my Jewish identity affects my life and career decisions, mostly through terror. But no, seriously, look, it's really a set of values and the way you think about yourself. I also believe, more than that, it's really about how you lead your life. And sort of, I have like a kind of philosophy that, what a good life actually is how much happiness you create in other people. And it's sort of almost on a weighted scale where the people who should be the closest to you get the highest weight. So your immediate family, your friends, your less immediate family, your less immediate friends, and then kind of out. And I kind of view my life in that way. It's maybe a derivation of Jewish values, but it's never far from my thinking.
Okay. Moving on to future of cities and entrepreneurship, I know you've been involved with countless number of institutions that have been built in New York, everywhere from the waterfront in Williamsburg to around Brooklyn Heights to a new initiative you're pioneering at the Shed here in New York. When you think about what are some of the new ways to move and think about urban innovation in cities, what are the criteria, the benchmarks for you to think about how you create a lot of value for people who live here? And then when you think about your current role as CEO of Sidewalk Labs, building a new urban infrastructure in Toronto, how have those lessons and ideas from New York guided what you are doing in Toronto?
So there's a couple of things. The first is I've grown to really appreciate the power of platforms and what they can actually mean, and how you have to be humble about how much you can plan versus how you can create conditions for other people to be successful. We think about sort of the west side of Manhattan, the platform was actually sort of a physical platform, and the notion of building over rail yards on the west side, or even thinking about the High Line, ultimately what we felt like our job in government to do was to create the conditions for other people to be successful. I think that notion of the platform, which in many cases was sort of physical in what we did in government, is becoming a combination of physical and digital. And that's really guiding our work to create a new city, district of a city in Toronto. It's interesting, you mentioned the Shed, and I brought it up earlier. So Shed's a great example of how you use platforms ultimately to create a new kind of community. So, when we were replanning the West Side as part of the Bloomberg administration, and I know not everybody here knows New York so well, but my guess is almost everybody here has actually been on the High Line. How many people here have been on the High Line? Okay, overwhelmingly. So the High Line, was an old freight line, and back in 2005, we actually rethought the entire west side of Manhattan, basically from Times Square all the way down to the Meatpacking District, and we did it in 2 simultaneous efforts. One was in West Chelsea, and we decided to save the High Line and then rethink the area around it. The northern part is called Hudson Yards, and it's dominated by rail yards that were going to be then decked over and buildings built on top. And in order to make it all work, we had to extend the subway into the area. So this is this huge area of New York that was like a complete wasteland beforehand, particularly the northern part of it. And so we decided, though, that we wanted to give like heart and soul to this new community, and creating a cultural institution in the middle of it would help to do that. In New York, you've always seen sort of capital follow culture in a way. So we set aside the single best parcel, we thought, in this entire new West Side for a to-be-determined cultural institution. We had no idea what it was going to be. We just had two criteria. One was it had to be unlike anything else in New York, which is hard because there's 1,200 cultural institutions in New York. And second, it had to play a role in keeping New York on the leading edge culturally in the world. So two very modest criteria. And we talked to people in the art world, all in New York, around the world, and eventually had an insight, which is relevant to the question. And the insight was that here in the 21st century, what makes the 21st century different is the internet. And what the internet actually enables, obviously has potentially negative side effects, but it enables people to collaborate in new ways. And the fact was we were starting to see all sorts of kind of remarkable collaborations occurring across arts disciplines. And we were hearing this over and over, and what we were hearing was existing institutions were actually generally not capable, either physically or programmatically, of accommodating this new art, because they tended to be very fixed or siloed in their missions and in their buildings. So we decided to create the world's most connected and flexible cultural institution. And this thing is so flexible, literally it's like a transformer. The building moves, it expands and contracts. It's kind of amazing. It's opening in April. That same logic about sort of connectivity and flexibility, sort of building on the notion of a platform, because we really see this place as a platform for artists to project their dreams and visions onto rather than limiting them, is also the same approach that we're trying to bring to Toronto.
Pulling out the thread of digital meets physical, Sidewalk Labs has obviously been working with the City of Toronto and thinking about the next phase of urban infrastructure. At the same time, there have been certain announcements, especially in the past 2 weeks, about certain agreements that third parties might be able to access civilian data. We're now 2 days away from the midterms, the first midterms in which social media had a pretty resounding effect on the outcome of the election, notwithstanding with Facebook and other concerns about privacy and data sharing agreements. Do you personally have any concerns about the way Sidewalk Labs is going to interact with civilian data in Toronto? And is there any way that civilians can continue to place trust in large technology companies that know us better than ourselves?
Absolutely have concerns, and I think what we are evolving toward is a pretty revolutionary approach to dealing with it. There is this fear up there that, well, this isn't all about data. Data can help produce meaningful improvements in services and quality of life, but it needs to be managed extraordinarily carefully. We have always assumed that. We took a lot of grief from lots of people who, while we were formulating our plans. But our view is we shouldn't be the ones to dictate how that data is used. In fact, what we've proposed is that the urban data that is generated effectively in public space, should actually not be controlled by us. That there ought to be an independent entity, probably we've called it a civic data trust, that does it, that we should have to apply for any application just like anybody else. That the presumption is that data is actually freely available, and that all of the architecture, systems architecture for this should actually be open at the same time. We think that's actually going to set a very different standard for the use of data in public spaces. And it's really different than what people would assume a company that is affiliated with Google would actually do. We're at a time when, look, this issue is ubiquitous. Everybody is struggling with it. There is no kind of protocol or regime that does anything. Cameras, sensors, they're everywhere, and we don't have any control over any of it. We think that's actually wrong. and that, in fact, it should be a public asset, should be controlled effectively by the public with maybe a novel approach to governance, and that we should live by the same rules as everybody else.
We have 10 minutes left, and I think there's going to be a lot of questions from the audience, so we're going to open it up to a Q&A.
Hi, I'm Darshan Padmanabhan. I just graduated from Boston University in May, software developer. So you talked a lot about like how technology and this like new kind of novel approach to governance would work. Like for like potentially like Sidewalk Labs is doing a project in Toronto, and you're gathering all this data. So how does it work where like technology and governance seem to be at odds with each other right now, and how does like what's the new approach from the government perspective for like harnessing technology in a way that like is useful and like works in symphony with technology or with technology companies?
Well, it's a really good question because government basically doesn't usually have any idea how to deal with it. And in fact, as sort of we have worked in Toronto, we've had this lead on some level, and there's even a degree of resentment over the fact that we're leading rather than government, but government generally won't because government, at least the vast majority of governments, tend to follow on complicated new issues. The beauty of doing what we're doing is that we think it can be a laboratory that can be looked at by other governments and other actors all over the world. One of the reasons that we chose to do this, and basically what we're trying to do is build, say, a new district. It'd be about 800 acres, so about the size of Central Park. It would hope for over time have about 100,000 people, 75,000 jobs. Would actually be quite diverse. But it's on a brownfield today, where essentially there is nothing there. And one of the reasons we actually chose to do it in a place where there are no people, essentially no jobs, and almost no real infrastructure is it gives us a chance to start from scratch, to avoid the complications of getting things done where there are a lot of people and other stuff, so that we actually could be more radical, but also do it in the context of working through issues with government, but where we thought we'd have some degree of freedom. So what we hope to do here, and one of the reasons we decided to do this, is to set an example, not just of sort of the physical aspects, what we think in terms of mobility or infrastructure or building form or the public realm, even social infrastructure, but also policy, and be able to work through those things, often in sort of painful processes with government and with the public, in order to show what might be possible, and then enable other places to adapt what we do to their own unique conditions. That's what we think is in many ways the greatest benefit of what we're trying to do.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Bradley. I have a question about 5G technology. How do you see 5G being implemented in smart cities?
Well, first of all, let me say, disabuse you of the notion that there's anything like a smart city. I actually think cities are pretty smart in general, and I sort of resent sort of the fact that the IBMs and Ciscos have tried to foist onto the world this notion that cities are dumb and they're somehow going to make cities smart. You know, so let me just disabuse you of that. And I think virtually anyone who has interacted with sort of these big sort of companies learns the hard way that cities kind of resent that. That said, you know, look, I think 5G over time will be revolutionary, but it will obviously get deployed in fits and starts. The carriers will inevitably dominate that in some way, and you know, like with most things, they'll have to work with government to get the franchise and licenses, which will not be easy. But you know, over the course of the next 10 to 15 years, I think it's inevitable. And then, what they've done is basically create platforms for other people to build applications on in addition to their own. So, it'll evolve like the others have, but it'll be pretty revolutionary, but evolutionary at the same time.
My name is David Paulin. I'm a senior at Vanderbilt, and I was a part of Excel in 2017. Given your expertise and experience in this space, what do you think is the greatest problem facing cities? Whether that problem be more tangible, such as public transportation, or something that's more systemic, such as a barrier to efficient innovation?
I think the biggest problem will be different depending on the city. If you take sort of the super attractive cities, the ones that are growing very rapidly, in part because they're viewed as magnets for opportunity, like New York or San Francisco or London or Toronto now, by far the biggest problem is the affordability issue. And that's very different than a place like Detroit, which is my hometown, where the problem is attracting people. I always believed, and in my book, I talk a lot about sort of the importance of growth, that the single best indicator of growth, of success of a city is that it's growing. That it's growing in terms of the number of people, the number of jobs, the number of visitors, because those are all customers, and if you're attracting a lot of them, it means you're doing something right, not unlike a business. But there's a bigger reason, and the bigger reason is when you grow, the marginal revenue from those additional people, jobs, visitors, typically is greater than the cost of supporting them, and therefore you produce excess revenue that, if you're smart, can be reinvested back into improving the quality of life, which is to attract more people, right? So the virtuous cycle actually gets perpetuated. That said, making those right investments, which is, by the way, why this whole notion of investment and return and how you think about it is so important, is hard. And many cities actually have failed to actually accommodate the growth in a way that is both fair, but also where there's enough supply. So what we see in most of these cities is that they don't produce enough housing. There are inefficiencies in the housing market, and as a result, prices go up astronomically, especially for housing. We actually, in New York, sensing that that was going to be an issue, created a housing plan for 165,000 affordable units, meaning the units were subsidized. They were for people who otherwise wouldn't be able to afford to live in the communities where the housing was actually built. So for 500,000 people, and it was not enough, in part because people kept coming after the financial crisis and the financial markets dried up. So managing sort of that growth, prompting the growth and then managing the growth is, in my view, sort of the single biggest issue that successful cities actually have. For ones where there's decline, again, you have to find a way to reverse that decline. So again, now another complicated issue is, how do you make cities fair? How do you create opportunity for everyone? Obviously, you have to deal with the affordability issue. And that involves, again, making smart fund investments basically in opportunity. And we could go into a lot more on that. But I think those opportunity and fairness are the two biggest issues we generally have, particularly in successful cities.
I think we have time for one more.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Becky Haft, Excel class of 2011. When you talk about cities and investment in cities, there's obviously this return that you just spoke about, and so much of the issues that I think we're seeing in our politics and the divide in our country is cities versus rural areas. How are you how are the innovations that you're thinking about at Sidewalk Labs able to be brought to maybe more rural areas, or what can we do where in areas where that isn't that level of return to still create vibrancy and prosperity?
So it's a really good question because in many parts of this country, there's basically not a lot that we can actually do. I mean, it's just the reality. Nobody wants to say it. You've heard, President Trump talk about the coal industry, for example, and you can pump as much money into it if you want at the end of the day, but you're not going to reverse the economics of coal, particularly in a world in which people other than him are, and his merry band, are concerned about things like climate change. So, really what we have to think about doing, I think, is less about cities versus rural, is we have to find ways of giving people who are being left behind opportunity and dignity. And I think that's what's being lost in this entire discussion is, yes, there are people, 40% of the country, who slavishly follow President Trump, and we grieve at the way in which he stokes their frustration and anger, but we have to respect the fact at the end of the day that they're angry for a reason, and it's a valid reason. The world is changing. They are feeling incredibly anxious about it, and we haven't done anything about it. And so the question is, what do we do? I think it's going to require a series of really dramatic policy choices at a national level that will ultimately involve redistribution and investment and new kinds of work programs that we haven't seen in this country since probably the Depression. But it's not necessarily a city versus country thing. It's people who are angry because they're feeling left behind.
Dan, on behalf of the entire Excel community, I want to thank you for joining us today, and it was a pleasure having you.
Thank you. Nice job.